Don't judge me. Things aren't going right. Don't judge. It's fine.
See, if you didn't tell us they weren't going right, though, we would think it's going right.
Yeah, I can't help it. I can't. Don't judge me. We love that one. Don't judge me. Don't judge me. We want to be able to dish it out, but we don't want to have to take it, right? And that kind of the way it goes. We've been talking the last several weeks, and we're getting close to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Some of you may be highly relieved at that. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go after that, so I'll dwell on this sermon for a little bit longer. But up to this point, Jesus has been talking about this idea of what it looks like to really trust God. So last week we talked about how God provides for our needs, and usually God does that by putting other people in our path. And then we come to this thing about judgment, right? Don't judge unless you would be judged. And I was thinking about that phrase because one of the things that we notice a lot in the culture, one of the favorite Christian phrases of non-Christians is don't judge, right? You're not supposed to judge me. You Christians aren't supposed to be judging me. We hear that all the time. I did a little research this week. I had to go back a little ways to find the statistics. I knew I'd seen it somewhere. The Barna Group, which is a polling organization, and they do polls for a lot of Christian organizations, they did a big research study about 9 years ago. And they went and they asked people who were outside of the church, non-Christians, what are your impressions of Christians? Number 2 on the list was judgmental. 87% of non-Christians said they find Christians to be judgmental. That was number 2. Number 1 was that Christians are anti-homosexual, and number 3 was that Christians are hypocrites. You can actually kind of lump all 3 of those together under that big judgment umbrella, right? The world perceives us as being judgmental. Now, whether that perception is right or wrong is really not our call. Because we might look and say, well, listen, we're just holding true to the word, right? We're just being faithful. You all don't get it. Listen, perception is reality. If that is how we're perceived, we probably need to look in a mirror and figure out why it is we're being perceived. Even if we don't think it's a fair perception, we need to try to figure out why the culture perceives us as being judgmental and hypocritical. This is one of those places where I think we need to be just really honest with ourselves and say, what is it that causes us to be that way? And I think this Sermon on the Mount kind of gives us some clues as to why we behave that way and maybe what the solution might be. So last week we were talking about this issue of trust, right? Trust God. Trust God to provide. Don't worry about what to eat. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. God will provide for those physical needs that we have. Well, why would we not expect that God would also provide for our spiritual needs if he provides for our physical needs? And one of our spiritual needs is a need to be known, a need to be seen, a need to be recognized. And so a few weeks ago, when we were talking about Jesus kind of calling out the people and saying, why do you make sure that people see you when you do your religious duties? Why do you want to make sure that you're known for your giving and when you fast and the big lofty words you use when you pray? You know, why would you do that when your relationship with God is much more important than your relationship with people, that you're really just doing those things to elevate your own sense of self-esteem? And that really, at its heart, that's that self-righteousness, the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees that Jesus warned against earlier in the sermon. Well, this goes to this spiritual need for identity. Why are you claiming your identity from what other people think of you? Why do you need them to tell you who you are? Why do you do all of these things to be noticed, to be seen, to be known, when you need to be known by God? Don't store up for yourself treasures on earth, we talked about a couple weeks ago. Don't sell out to those systems and structures that serve only to elevate our sense of power and prestige and status. But instead, store up for yourself treasures in heaven. Invest yourself in those things that are important to God, things like justice and mercy and compassion and love, authentic, unconditional, radical, ridiculous love. Invest yourself in those things. Allow God to provide for you as you learn to trust God more and more. Allow for him to provide for you for those physical needs. Allow him to put other people in your path if your needs require that someone else is in just the right place and at just the right time. Learn to trust that God will take care of those needs, and learn to trust that God will take care of this need we have to be known, this need we have for our identity. Jesus is talking about, first of all, we need to understand what we mean by the word judge, right? Because there is a place for making correct judgments in the world, right? We need to judge, what's safe from what's unsafe. We need to judge what's healthy from what's unhealthy. If we were in a court of law in some situation, we would want to make sure that the judge in that case would take in all of the information and then would judge fairly. There is a place for judgment. That's not the kind of judgment Jesus is talking about, though. Jesus is talking about that judgment that we do when we're trying to gain our self-identity or self-esteem by doing that one thing that we're so good at, that we lift ourselves up by putting someone else down. That we are really, really anxious to look out and identify the sins, whatever you want to call it, of other people. And listen, we're all good Christians. We're willing to admit that we're sinners. I haven't met a Christian yet that's not willing to admit that they're a sinner. But somehow, someone else's is always worse than mine, right? And I can always make myself look a little better by comparing myself to that person for whatever that sin is. But that's really, that kind of judgment really is condemnation, right? You could almost say condemnation is a synonym for that kind of judgment. We're condemning people when we say those kinds of things, when we're trying to lift ourselves up by putting someone else down. What we're really saying is, you're really not worthy, right? So what's our favorite motto, right? Love the sinner, hate the sin. I wish we would get that out of our Christian dialogue. Love the sinner, hate the sin. I'm all for love the sinner. But if you've ever been on the other side of that, it's easy for us. I love you, brother. I love you, sister. I don't want you to go to hell. You need to shape up. You need to straighten up your behavior because I love you. How does that sound when you're on the other side of that? All I hear when I'm on the other side is judgment. You're not worth the air you're taking up. I wish you would quit wasting this air I could be breathing. We have to understand how we're perceived on the other side. Listen, our intentions might be good. They really might. We might genuinely want to help other people sometimes by pointing out things that are harmful. Clearly, if our kid's about to stick a fork in a light socket, we're going to say, don't do that. That's good, healthy judgment, right? But when we start telling people who they're allowed to fall in love with, or whether they should live or die because of the color of their skin, or the religion that they happen to practice, that's condemnation.
Amen.
That is not the love of Jesus. That is love of self. That's really all that boils down to. And Jesus says, why do you look at the speck or the splinter in your brother's eye and ignore the log in your own? We usually read that and we say, okay, I have to examine my sin before I call someone else out on their sin. I've got news for you. The log isn't your sin. The log is condemnation. When we've got that log of condemnation in our own eyes, the only thing we can see in other people is their sin. We can't see them for their full humanity. We can't see everything that's going on in their lives. All we can see is that splinter that is smaller than our log, but we can't get past it, right? That plank in our eye, that condemnation blinds us to seeing the full picture. That only God can see. Only God knows what's going on there. It's not our job to judge. It's only our job to love. Don't try to pick that splinter out of your brother's eye while you're blinded by the log of condemnation. Now, Paul will say later in his letters that within the church, there is a healthy way to point out people's sin to them, to point out places where they need help. But we don't do that through a condemning attitude. And Paul says, let those among you who are wise, let those among you who are spiritually mature, who are close to God, let them be the ones to have those hard conversations with people. Because the only way to do that is to empty ourselves of any condemnation and then to lovingly try to restore, not to exclude, but to restore people to a right relationship with God and one another. Don't pick out the splinter in your brother's eye until you can take that log of condemnation out of your own. And then when he says this thing about casting pearls to pigs and giving dogs what is holy, pigs and dogs were unclean in that Jewish culture at that time. Jesus' audience would have understood that he was talking about Gentiles, right? Non-Jewish people. And he's saying, don't judge them either, basically, is what he's saying. A lot of times we look at this verse and we say, well, he's saying, these people just aren't ready to hear the gospel yet, right? So why would we waste our time? That would be taking that completely out of context. He says, don't even judge those non-believers, right? Those Gentile people. Because you don't know what's going on. You don't know what's good for them. Why would you give your great pearls of wisdom to pigs that can't digest? Why would you do that? Why would you waste your time doing that? So this whole thing about judgment and condemnation, again, Jesus is trying to point us back to what it looks like to have a right relationship with God, to allow God to be the judge. You have heard it said, right? But I tell you, Jesus is turning the tables on the religious traditions of the time and trying to get people to understand that God is love. And that as God's people, we are called to be the presence of love in the world, whatever that looks like, and as hard as it might become. And that's a hard thing for us, again, as the church, to look and try to understand why people outside look at us and say, one of the reasons I don't want to be around those people is because they're always judging. And if I look in the mirror myself, I can tell you it's true. We do it all the time. But the Word of God is made to transform our lives. It's not something we just come in here and hear like consumers come into a play on Sunday morning. It's made for us to internalize, to take it out, and to let it start to change our lives, to be intentional about listening to that still small voice of God, speaking truth and speaking love into our life. And so the question is, what kind of people are we going to be? Are we going to continue down that path? Are we going to continue to let the world define us for those things we stand against instead of those things we stand for? Are we going to be the kind of people that step into those hard places, that come alongside the people that everybody else wants to judge and exclude and marginalize and oppress, and say, we love you? No but. No love the sinner, hate the, just love. We love you. God will straighten this out, whatever it is. We can trust that God will be the judge. We don't, thank God, right? I can't do that job. I'm not qualified for that. I don't think any of us are. When we can learn to trust God, not with just our physical needs, but that spiritual need to be known, transformation begins to happen. And as the church, as we're transformed as a people, the world begins to notice that, begins to define us for that instead of for all these negative things, but for the love that we show, for the places that we're willing to step into to change the world. Let's pray. Loving God, it so often goes against our nature to not point out the mistakes of others, to not try to lift ourselves up at the expense of someone else. It seems like sometimes that we can't just let things go that may not seem right to us. And so, God, we need your help to learn to trust you more, to gain our identity not from those around us, not for what the culture would say about us, but for who you say we are. Give us the courage, God, to follow more and more in your ways as we seek to be the ambassadors of your kingdom, to bring your love alive on earth as it is in heaven. All this we ask this morning in the name of your risen Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.